Hello and welcome back to Code Companion. This is episode number 9. And in this tutorial, we're going to work on making our programs feel a bit more web-like. Because up until this point, everything we've been doing, all the programs that we've been writing, we've just been writing to the terminal or writing to the console using statements, using functions like console.log. But now we want to add the visual element or the UI element, and we're going to do that using HTML. So rather than using console.log to write our results to the terminal, instead we're going to be able to open up an HTML file, have our code run in the background, and print the results to the screen within our browser instead. So let's take a look. So as usual, we're going to start by making a new directory or a new folder for the code that we're going to write in this video, and we'll just call this directory DOM manipulation. Once we create that directory, we can move into it using cd. So we'll do cd DOM manipulation, and then we're going to create two files. We're not just going to create a JavaScript file, but we're also going to create an index.html file. So we'll call the JavaScript file main.js, and then we'll call the HTML index.html. This is the HTML that's going to contain the results of our program, because we're going to write it to the HTML. So we can just do touch main.js, touch index.html like that, and that creates the files that we're going to need for this tutorial. All right, so once those files have been created, you can then open the folder in Visual Studio Code, and here we have our empty index.html file and our empty main.js file. And what we want to do with our program is we're going to have a button on the page, and the user's going to be able to click that button. When they click that button, we're going to present a prompt to the user where they're going to enter in some text. Once they enter in some text, they hit OK, then we're going to take that value and write it to the HTML so that the user can see what they entered. The first thing we're going to need to do is populate this index.html page. So we need a rough scaffolding of an HTML page. So what we're going to do is just go back to my blog post, and I'm just going to copy this, paste it over here, and I'll increase the font size just a little bit. And the main thing we're worried about here is this script tag. This is how we include JavaScript that we're writing in some other file like main.js into our HTML. So notice we set source equal to main.js, and that's just literally the name of the file. There's some other stuff too, like this title. That is, I can just go ahead and show you now. That's the title that shows up right here, Code Companion -DOM manipulation. There's nothing on the page right now because we don't have anything in it, but that's what the title tag is. And then like this doc type and meta character set, we'll just go back to my blog post. I linked to the Mozilla Developers Network's anatomy of an HTML document, because they actually describe all of this in depth for you. And why reinvent the wheel if somebody's already done it better than me? So let's take a look at this doc type HTML. They say, in the midst of time when HTML was young, doc types were meant to act as links to a set of rules that the HTML had to follow to be considered good HTML, which meant error checking, other useful things. However, these days, no one really cares about them, and they are really just a historical artifact that needs to be included for everything to work right. For now, that's all you need to know. So even like a technical resource like this, they're basically saying, just include it. Don't worry about it. It's not a big deal. It's just, if you want to write HTML, you got to have that in there. In addition to that, there's the HTML tag. That's basically what says, this is HTML. You also have the head tag, which is where we added our JavaScript. They say this element acts as a container for all the stuff you want to include on the HTML page that isn't the content you are showing to your page's viewers. So our JavaScript is going to do stuff like get input from the user, write it to our HTML, but that's just like the functionality. It's not the actual content that they're seeing. The content that the user sees is in the body tag, as it says here. This contains all the content that you want to show users when they visit your page, whether it's text, images, videos, games, and so on. So that's where we're going to put our values that we're going to write whenever we get input from the user. That will go in body. And then they also have, we already covered title, and then they also have this meta character set equals UTF-8, which by the way, is also in head. And they say there, this element sets the character set your document should use to UTF-8, which includes most characters, blah, blah, blah. Essentially, it can now handle any textual content. There is no reason not to set this, and it can help avoid some problems later on. So once again, just like doctype HTML, they're just telling you, just put it in there. Don't worry about it. So this isn't like some big thing you have to worry about. This is a rough HTML skeleton you're pretty much going to see anytime you create an HTML page. So as far as I'm concerned, the big thing you want to know is body is where everything the user sees goes. Head is where we put stuff like our JavaScript files. If we had some CSS, we would also put it in head. And that's it, because I don't think you need to worry about this character set too much. And HTML, I think that's self-explanatory. If you want to make an HTML page, you need these HTML tags. Okay, so now that we have our HTML skeleton here, we have our script tag set to main.js. What we're going to do is kind of go back to square one. And we're just going to write a very simple program, which I think you may be able to guess, hello world, because we just want to make sure that this is actually working. So we're just doing the most simple program we could possibly do, just writing hello world to make sure that our HTML and JavaScript are linked together and that they're working. So we'll save this, then we'll go back to Chrome, and I've already opened my file here. As you can see, I have the path to index.html. So I can just open the console. I did that with Command-Alt-J. If you want to go up here, you can go to View, Developer, JavaScript console. And as you can see, it is working. We have hello world written to the console within our HTML page, so we know that the two are linked together and everything's working okay. Now that our HTML and JavaScript are linked together and we know that it's working, we need to add a button to our page, because remember, we want the user to be able to click a button, and when they click that button, it presents a prompt for the user to enter some input. So we're going to go back to Visual Studio Code. We're going to go to our index.html, and then within body, we're going to add a button for the user. So we're going to do that using the button element, and we're also going to add an ID, which we're going to set to a name like display prompt button. And this ID name is a name that we come up with. You can use anything. Display prompt button isn't like some special HTML keyword. This is just a random name I made up. We could add anything here. So we do button, we add an ID, which you'll see that the need for this shortly, and then notice how it added that closing tag for us. But within here, we're just going to add some text like click here. So we're going to save that, and then we'll go back to Chrome. If we refresh this, you'll see our hello world still there because we haven't removed it from the JavaScript. But now we have a little button here. Click here, but it doesn't do anything. So we want that button to do something. We want it to present the user with a prompt. And the way we're going to do this is using what's known as an event handler. An event handler basically says that when a certain event happens, like the button is clicked, we want to run some code. So let's see how we do that. So once again, we're going to go back to Visual Studio Code, then we're going to go to main.js, and we can just go ahead and delete this. And the first thing we're going to do is create a variable. We're going to call it display prompt button because it's just going to map to that button that we just created in the HTML. So we're going to call our variable display prompt button, and then we're going to set it equal to document.get element by ID, and within that we're going to pass it a string, which is display prompt button, like that. So document is a special object that's our HTML document, and it has a function, get element by ID. So we pass it a string, and in this case it's the ID name, and what it does is it goes into our HTML, it goes into what's known as the document object model, and it finds an element with that ID. And once it finds it, if it exists, it sets it to our display prompt button. So with this, we essentially have an object that's tied to the HTML. So we now have like a code representation of some visual element within the HTML. So this gives us a handle on that button we just created. But we need an event handler, right? We said when that button is clicked, we want to be able to tell it to do something. We want to write some code to say, do this when that button's clicked. So the way we do that is we're going to say display prompt button like that, and then we're going to do add event listener. See how helpful these autocorrects are? So add event listener, and add event listener is a method that takes two arguments. The first one is the event that it's going to listen on, that it's going to wait for. So we can go ahead and add that. That's going to be click. And then after that, we just add a function. And this is where we write our code. So right down here, I'm just going to put a semicolon. And then here, we're going to do console.log, and we'll just put something like clicked, like that. So we first get an object representing the button in document object model, and then we use that object and a method add event listener to say, okay, we're going to wait for a click, and when that happens, you're going to execute this function. So when that button is clicked, it should say clicked. So we'll go back to Google Chrome, we'll refresh the page, and you see an error. It says cannot read property add event listener of null. Now the reason this is happening is whenever our main.js file is loaded, which attempts to look for a button, the content of the HTML hasn't finished loading yet. So we're searching for a button, the content hasn't finished loading yet, so when it tries to find this display prompt button, it returns null because the content hasn't been loaded yet. So it looks for the button, it says it's not here, it returns us null, and then we try doing add event listener on null, which throws us this error. So the way we're going to fix this is we have to add another event listener before our code runs. So we're going to go back here, and above this, I'm just going to do document.add event listener. And the event here, instead of click, is going to be DOM content loaded, which might be a little self-explanatory. It just means once the DOM has finished loading, then then run this function here. So now instead of just having this code right here, what we're going to do instead is put all of this within the event listener for DOM content loaded. So now the contents of main.js isn't going to run until this DOM content loaded event has fired. So we can save this. We'll go back to Chrome, refresh, and now we see there's no error. Then we can go to click here, and we see that clicked has fired. So before, when we didn't have this DOM content loaded, it was looking for a button that didn't exist, but now we've wrapped the entire thing in another event listener that says, okay, once the DOM content has been loaded, then execute this entire function. And since it's loaded, it's now able to find that button, add an event listener for the click event, and as we just saw, it actually console.logged our clicked string. All right, so now that our event handler our event listener is working, since this console.log statement fired, we can update this to instead present the user with a prompt so that we can get some input from them. So what we're going to do is we're going to declare a variable input, and we're going to set this equal to the function prompt. And in this, we're just going to put a string like, what is your favorite Pokemon? Like that. So this prompt function is going to present the user with a prompt. They're going to enter in some text, and whatever they enter in is going to be assigned to this input variable. And then just below that, just to make sure everything is working okay, we're going to just console.log what it is that the user gives us. So we'll save that, go back to Chrome, refresh this. Make sure you refresh, because if you just start clicking, it's not going to get the changes. So refresh, go to click here, and boom, there you see. What is your favorite Pokemon? So I'll add something like Blastoise, click OK, and it says input Blastoise. So now we know that our prompt is working correctly. But as we said earlier, we want to not just console.log this, we want to actually write it into the HTML. We want this Blastoise to not be here. We want it to be somewhere up here, like under this click here button. So we'll go back to Visual Studio Code, we'll go to index, and below our button, we're just going to add a p tag. Once again, we're going to put an ID. We'll just say Pokemon. We'll close that, and we're not even going to put any text in there. We just want an empty paragraph tag for us to write some text to. So we do that, then we're going to go to main.js, and now we're going to create another variable here to have an object representing that p tag that we just created. So right here, we're going to create a variable. We'll call it view, and then we're going to do document.get element by ID again, just as we did above, and we're going to add Pokemon, the ID that we specified in our HTML. And then down here, we can just do view, because that's our handle on the HTML, that specific p element. We'll do view dot, and it has an inner HTML property, which basically says the contents of that element. We're going to say view.inner HTML of that object is going to be equal to the input that the user gives us. So now we have DOM content loaded. We wait for the DOM content to load before we do anything. We get an object for our button. We create an object for our paragraph tag, this one right here, which is essentially the view that we're going to write to. And then we have our event listener for click. Once that event happens, we're going to run this function right here. And we say, okay, our input is equal to whatever the return value is of that prompt, whatever the user enters into the prompt. And then the inner HTML of view is just going to equal whatever the user enters. So we're going to save this, go back to Chrome, we'll refresh it, click that, add a Pokemon, hit OK, and now instead of logging it out to the console, we now have Blastoise written out to the HTML. All right, but we want to add one little update here, because if you'll notice, if we already have a Pokemon written right here, and I add another Pokemon, it overwrites it. So we can only ever have one Pokemon in our HTML, and most Pokemon trainers have more than one, right? We're not one of those scrubs that just has one Caterpie. We want multiple Pokemon. So we want to be able to have multiple Pokemon listed within our view as well. So the way we're going to do that is we're going to go back to our HTML, and instead of this p tag, what we're going to use instead is the UL tag, which stands for unordered list. So now we'll be able to have a list of Pokemon here instead. But because we're using an unordered list, we're going to have to change our code just a little bit. So what we're going to do is we're going to leave this the same, because we're still going to get some input from the user. But then below this, we're actually going to create an HTML element to add to the unordered list. So what we're going to do is we're just going to create a variable like let list item. We're going to set that equal to document.create element. So there's an ability to create elements using this document object. And in it, we're going to pass it the string li, just like that. And then we're going to do list item, dot inner HTML equals the input that the user passed in. And then now that we're using an unordered list, we can get rid of that. And we're just going to do view.append child, and we're going to pass it that list item we just created. So now we get input from the user, we create a new HTML element, we set the inner HTML of that new element to the input from the user, and then we use the view object that represents the Pokemon unordered list to say, okay, append this list item that we just created to that unordered list. So we'll save this, go back to Chrome, refresh this, and now we'll add Pokemon Blastoise. As you can see, it already looks a little bit different. The default styling of an unordered list is just a bullet, but let's try adding another Pokemon. So we'll do that. Sure enough, it works. We can now add more than one Pokemon. We'll add one more. There we go. Now we can have more than one Pokemon, because we ain't no scrub. We go out and we capture more than one Pokemon. We got a whole bag of Pokemon ready to go, right? Before we wrap up, what we're going to do is go back to Visual Studio Code, and we're going to create a function to just move some of this code that's kind of related to one task into its own function. So like right here, really all we're doing is creating a new list element and adding it to a list, right? So we're going to take all of this code and actually move it into its own function. That way we can just say, okay, get the input from the user, and then we'll call our new function right here that just says, okay, add it to the view. So up here, we're going to create a function. Whoops. We'll call it function add list item, and this is going to take, this function is going to have two parameters. The first parameter is going to be the input we want to add to our HTML, and then the second parameter is going to be the target, or the object within the view that we want to add this input to. So that's our function. And then here we can just paste the code that we had before. So once again, we do let list item equals create element, the new list item. We set the inner HTML to the input that's going to be passed in. And then the only thing we need to update now is view is no longer view. It's going to be target, because it's referencing the value that's passed in, whatever element within the HTML that we're adding it to. So now down here, we can use our new function. So we're going to say add list item. We're going to pass it the input that we get from the prompt right here. And then our target is going to be this view object that we get from document.getElement by ID with this Pokemon. So we'll just do add list element input, and then we'll do target like that. We'll save it, and then go back to Chrome. We'll refresh just to make sure everything's working okay. Whoops. Target's not defined. Oh, notice what I did. I was referencing the parameter name up here. What I needed to put was view. So view like that, save, go back, refresh, and now it should work. So Charizard, that's what happens when I'm trying to talk and write at the same time. Sometimes I get the words that I'm talking about and the words I'm typing mixed up. So Charizard, Blastoise, cool, everything's working fine. Caterpie is definitely not one of my favorite Pokemon, but there you go. Everything's working and back to its original state before we moved things into its own function. All right, so to finish this, I'm going to go to GitHub, create a new repository. I'm just going to call it DOM manipulation, and I'll create that repository. And then I'm going to copy this little bit right here, go back to our terminal, and I'll just do git init to initialize our git repository. I'm going to do git add period to add all of the files, and then I'm going to do git commit m, and I'll just say add DOM manipulation. So now all of those changes are ready to be pushed up to GitHub. I'm going to link my folder to the GitHub repository I just created by pasting in that command. And then I can just do git push origin master like that. So I got to add my username and password. Whoops. All right, there we go. And now I can refresh, and there's the code that we just created. All right, so if you enjoyed this video, go ahead and leave a like on the video so that other people can find it. If you have any questions or feedback, feel free to leave a comment and subscribe to the channel to stay up to date so that you get notified as soon as I release my next video. Thanks, guys, and I'll see you next time.